model and design of schools that still exists for the vast majority of the country in many ways, and we're trying to get out of. You've got a learner in a classroom for 12 years plus, and they are having to follow rules they didn't make, and they're having to listen to answers of questions that they didn't ask. In a human standpoint, like if you do that for enough time, what does it do to you? What does it do to your spirit? What does it do to your heart? What does it do to your mind? What does it do to your soul? Is that really in alignment with how we as people are and experience life?
Welcome back to the OpenEd podcast. I am your sometime host, Isaac Morehouse. Today, I am talking to Tyler Thigpen, who is, you got quite a bio, Tyler. So the head of the Forest School, which is affiliated with Acton Academy. We'll talk about that a little bit. And the Institute for Self-Directed Learning. And he's also got quite a stack of what I would say like mainstream high status credentials in academia, University of Penn, Graduate School of Education, a guest lecturer at Harvard School of Education. So you kind of have an interesting, if I look at your bio, it's like, hey, you're doing all this stuff in alt ed, but also clearly very respected in sort of the higher echelons of the education or higher education establishment. So maybe that's a good place to start, straddling those worlds. Or I don't know, maybe you tell me, is there something that it almost seems to me like if you go to, higher ed, anywhere where it's like, hey, a school of education that the best minds are talking about education, the future of education, what it should look like. They're often pretty open-minded and talking about some interesting things, but then somehow like that does not make its way through to policymakers, school administrators, sort of in the vast mainstream public school system. So there seems to be some kind of gap there. Is that
I think
a
it depends.
assessment?
First of all, Isaac, great to be here with you. Thanks for having me and for the kind words about the background. You know, I think it's fair, it just depends. I have a deep belief in the value of social institutions in the world. And by social institution, I mean a group of humans who have and are forming relationships around a shared mission. And that can look and take the shape in many forms. And of course, higher ed is a form of a social institution. And when I look back on my life and what really impacted my life, social institutions are just a huge part of it. And for each one, they've got their strengths and their weaknesses. I think some of the ones I'm affiliated with, I feel really proud of, and Penn and Harvard, and a few others that Regent College and the University of British Columbia that, are in some ways like very forward thinking and attract to those social institutions people who are motivated to make the world a better place, people who are motivated to excel, to meet needs and get a response. And that's really what drew me and continues to draw me there, honestly. And because they're such established social institutions, then there are these constraints that you've got to figure out how to work with. And there's some limitations, some serious limitations. And I think you've got people at each one of those organizations and others, thinking meaningfully about how to disrupt, and because they are being disrupted, and how to change those. And being in the alt ed space, if you will, to use your term, or an independent micro school or whatever you want to call it, there's just a lot of flexibility and nimbleness. And I'm an older guy and I've lost patience for boring learning environments for my own children and for kids in general. I've just seen too much at this point. I've seen ways that captivate 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and I'm just not willing to put up with stuff that I know is going to bore them, So how do I get that done? Well, I get that done by working with a team in an organization where there's a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, in the absence of anything else, like a really good heuristic is if it's really boring, maybe we should try to not do that, right? And like people, I think overlook that because there's sort of this assumption that like anything that's good for you also sucks, right? I think a lot of people who went through a typical school environment just have that feeling, well, if it's too fun, it must not be good for you. And if it's good for you, it must be boring. I think that's kind of new. If you go back and read historical accounts in this country, like pre-public school, pre-widespread public school, 1800s, even early 1900s, you see something really that seems really weird to modern readers. You hear kids from very young age up into their teens talking about how they wish they could go to school. They wish they could go learn. They wish they had books they only have 2 books in their house. And like they're so excited at the idea of like a new book. Somebody brings a book and they're just like reading it over and over again because this is, and I don't think that the human brain has somehow changed all of a sudden where learning is no longer fun. But there's just something about like understanding the value of being interested and excited and enjoying what you're doing.
I think
That
that's
I
a
think
great point,
that kind
Isaac.
of gets
And I
overlooked.
don't know about you and your, K-12 experience. For me, in my math classes, I had this one professor whom I loved dearly. And when I figured out the material and realized that what was being shared was not relevant to me, I'd put my head down on the desk and sleep. And she would change the spout on the spray bottle for her overhead projector and squirt me from across the room. you know, so I love the criteria, the standard. If it's boring, what are we doing? I think another one for me is, I'm a person of faith, but I think just from an anthropological standpoint, as humans, we all have these like ancient, beautiful thoughts, feelings and plans. They come from like an ancient, I think, beautiful place. And the designs of schools, really shut those down in many ways. Not the people in them. The people in them are incredible. I mean, they love kids for the most part, but the designs of them, kids don't get a chance to express and identify their feelings or, make plans and then learn from the natural consequences of their actions. And so how can we design human schools, humane schools where kids really can flourish? That to me, so boredom is up there. And then like, making plans, kids identifying their feelings and expressing them and living through natural consequences. That's another heuristic that you're bringing up.
It's interesting. And you mentioned, the faith component. I'm also a man of faith, but regardless, even if you're not, or if you have whatever various religious, outlook, human societies of any kind, human organizations to work, they have to have some sense of ethics. They have to have some kind of morality, some shared understanding of like roughly what it means to be good and to be bad, and things you shouldn't do and things you should do. And not that that's completely absent in society, but there's this kind of like false belief that you can have education with no moral component to it. And like education has historically, that's been sort of the main thing is like, yeah, you can learn, if you want to learn a skill, you go apprentice, right? If you want to learn a skill, you go work around people who have that skill and you'll learn whatever that skill is. The point of like education as something that's separate from the normal functioning of society, of the village, of the market, of the farm, is really to work more on that like moral faculty, is to kind of like help you have higher thoughts, understand better, develop, moral faculties. And that's a very ancient idea, sometimes misdirected. It doesn't make it good that that's the effort. But the fact that that's always been kind of a thought about education. And now we kind of have this idea where, no, it's purely just to like learn facts and like skills and ideas that are totally divorced from being a good person or a fulfilled person. It's kind of a strange
that
thing. It's very
resonates. I
anomalous in
love
human
you
history.
continuing to name what has gone before us. It's reminding me, one of my colleagues at our organization, Dr. Caleb Collier, wrote a book a few years ago, The History and Theoretical Roots of Self-Directed Learning, which is a big emphasis at our school. And he says something similar. He's like, this is not new. This is young people, as far back as Socrates and beyond that. I mean, they were hungry for learning, and it was question based, and there was a lot of freedom and agency and choice. And so I love you sort of hearkening back to that. And we've arrived, to your point. It seems like there was a book, I don't know if you came across this, Isaac. I just read it recently, maybe 3 years ago. It's called The Death of Character. And essentially, and there's a group of schools convened by the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, public and private schools, to really explore what you're talking about. Like, how can we consider in a transpartisan, culture, how can we consider morals and strong character? Because there's an absence of it. It's hard to say. It has been hard to say in the public sector, in our courts, in our businesses, in our schools, this is strong character and this is not, because the pushback is, well, who's to say? But I think we are, as a nation, realizing, that has a shelf life, that approach. And for us, and what I learned through that book and through this convening of great leaders, was that it begins with, guiding us to think through and guiding our students to think through not just themselves, but the other, that they somehow they're on the hook for themselves and their own growth, but they're also on the hook for the other, and it starts there, right? And if we don't buy into that, it's going to be a pretty self-centered society, just like you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. When I hear people talk about education or who worry about education, let's say in America specifically, and you often hear things like Americans' math test scores are lower than the rest of the world. This is concerning. Or kids today don't even know who the 20th president was. I'm like, I'm less concerned about that than the fact that when I go to a restaurant and the 20-year-old server comes to serve me, she's rude and cold and does a bad job. Or if I hire an employee and they agree to come in at a certain time and then they just don't show up and ghost me, the fact that those are so much more common to me is more troubling. I'm like, look, if kids are going to spend all this time being educated, okay, maybe they don't know historical facts that well. Maybe they don't know this or that. We can debate the importance of those, but it's always important to have a society where you believe keeping your word is good, treating people kindly is good. If you work for a company, you represent the company, and there's some level of honor involved in that and some pride in your work. Like, to me, the absence of those things are more concerning, but most people do not think of those as the job of school or of education. They think of, like, learning your arithmetic and whatever. And I'm like, but this is where most kids spend the vast majority of their life being shaped. If it's not going to try to teach them these character things, then where are they going to pick it up? I know Acton Academy, and I want to talk about the forest schools. They do have this emphasis on, like, what is your meaning? What is your purpose? What does it mean for you to live a good life? Not just what facts have you learned and how are your test scores? Like, why do you want these test scores? Do you want these test scores? Do you care about this kind of knowledge? What are you trying to achieve in life? And starting there as a goal. Is that kind of like a fair
Yeah,
way to very broadly characterize what is Acton
absolutely.
and in the
I
forest
think
school, what you're
a
trying to do?
holistic view of the learner, of the family, it's not just about academics. It's about the kind of people we are becoming. Are we loving? And one of the pillars of Acton, our network, is learning to be people of strong character, learning to be a person who's on a hero's journey, learning to be somebody who is thoughtful. At the forest school, the way we try to actualize that, we really emphasize trust and empathy and social capital, and we guide our learners to really try and to some level master trust, that they should know how to build trust with other people, and how trust is broken and how to trust is restored, for empathy, really how to make people feel heard, known, seen, and understood, and then how to make sure that they are knowing themselves, and being vulnerable to an extent. And the social capital, really developing meaningful, caring, enduring relationships with people who are like them, people who are different than them, people who are leaders, people who are in power, and tracking all that stuff. I mean, that's some of the stuff that we really care about, Isaac. And yeah, I mean, I'm curious from where you sit, if you observe parents and caregivers sort of turning the tide more towards what we're saying, or not. I mean, I definitely, I think the folks coming to us seem to resonate with that. And from where I sit, but then I think people get tempted, parents and caregivers, they get a little stressed, if their learner struggles, or falls behind, or maybe doesn't get into the school that they want to. They harken back to what they experienced, but what they say is they're kind of on the same track with us, generally speaking. But I'm curious what you say.
No, I completely think so. I grew up homeschooled way back when it was like barely legal. Um,
Awesome.
and now, I homeschool my own kids. We've had various mixes of micro schools and co-ops and private schools. Some of my kids have done public school in high school. We've had a whole mix of things, but what I've seen in the last, I would say it's been a gradual trend, but then when COVID hit, since then, it's just like spiked. People are suddenly kind of realizing that the experiment that has been going on for about 100 years, which is really like the aberration, right? Like, what people are realizing is kind of a return to a little bit more of a natural way of kids growing, learning, figuring out careers, entering those careers. Of course, technology changes all of these things in some ways, but there's some core things that kind of have always been true. And all of a sudden it was like, We're going to take every child as if they're just a moldable lump of dough, put them off into this factory completely divorced from the rest of the world, cram their heads with certain facts, and do all these things that are like very odd, right? We think of them as normal, but they're very odd in the scope of human history. And I think that you have this kind of like hit a breaking point where I think a lot of people are looking for something else. I mean, I just look at studies now. Traditional style public school enrollment has plummeted. Enrollment and interest in micro schools and hybrids and homeschooling,
Skyrocketing.
it's skyrocketing. So you definitely see that happening. You see people realizing like something is missing, something is not working here. You have a phrase I wanted to ask you about. I love this. It like totally captivated my imagination. You say you are trying to combat the
Yeah.
epidemic of dependent learners. Could you break down what do you think? What is a dependent learner, and why is that such an epidemic?
I think first of all, the way we come at it harkens back to what I was saying earlier, which is because the industrial age model and design of schools that still exists for the vast majority of the country in many ways, and we're trying to get out of. You've got a learner in a classroom for 12 years plus, and they are having to follow rules they didn't make, and they're having to listen to answers of questions that they didn't ask. And just in a human standpoint, like if you do that for enough time, what does it do to you? What does it do to your spirit? What does it do to your heart? What does it do to your mind? What does it do to your soul? And is that really in alignment with how we as people are and experience life, And I think if you ask more broadly the question in our society, like, is there any evidence of, in adulthood, an inordinate number of citizens who are dependent in some way on others, on entities, in ways that are really codependent, not a healthy interdependence, but like codependent, financially, emotionally. I mean, I think that's an interesting question to explore. We at the Institute for Self-Directed Learning and the Forest School, we believe that the industrial age model is graduating generations of dependent learners. And by that, we mean, folks who are waiting around on others to tell them what to do. Folks who do not have purpose-seeking skills, folks who have not learned to learn for themselves, like just the skill to be able to find a problem, ask all the questions associated with it, and then have the will and the skill to seek out the answers to all those questions that they have identified, is just crucial for, I think, our nation, for our world. If we're really going to enjoy life, if we're really going to restore places that are broken, if we're really going to, build culture, I think that's just a crucial skill. And I think we saw it when you mentioned COVID earlier. In March 2020, almost immediately, parents and caregivers across our nation, across the world, saw whether or not their kids were self-directed, whether or not they were dependent learners. If they were sitting around waiting on some older person to tell them what to do for their learning and for their own goals as people, that's a dependent learner right there. But if they were like, no, I got to get going, it's just going to look a little different. I'm working primarily online and from my house now, but like I got a purpose here. I'm learning. That's a more independent or interdependent self-directed learner. And so, I think I would commend folks who are listening to Zaretta Hammond, a great author, and who she in one of her books talks about the difference between an independent and a dependent learner. And it mentions some of the things that I've referenced. I've been deeply impacted by her work. I think it's called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain is the name of her book. But that's kind of how we think about it, Isaac. But I welcome your feedback. Does that resonate?
Oh, absolutely. It absolutely resonates. It's funny. I mean, as a parent, you can see this in little microcosms with your kids, the temptation to solve their problems for them or make the difficulty go away just to get it done quicker. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you need to do that. But that tendency, if you give into it all the time, they learn the way to solve a problem is to go ask somebody else to do it. And the ability to sit back and be like, even though I know the answer, or even though I could do it quicker than you, I'm okay watching you stumble through and figure it out on your own. That's not easy to do. And the more you care about someone, the harder it is to do, right? You have to kind of like let yourself understand that going through that struggle. And I think especially for kids who have been conditioned in more of a dependent environment, as a parent, if you decide to take them out of that, make that transition, there is a very difficult kind of detox period where they don't know. And you're like, I read all these stories of these self-directed learners doing all these amazing things. My kid's not doing anything. And they're like, what am I supposed to do? And all they want to do is play video games. Like, it's hard. There's a phase where they're going to have to kind of like detox a little bit. But getting through that and just continuing to keep that on your mind, like, what would it take for them to know how to not only have the question or the problem, but to know what to do to try to solve it and to start doing that on their own? And that's, I think it's a great starting point. So I got to throw an objection to you though. One that I hear a lot, and I'm sure you've heard many times. Okay, this is all great, Tyler. Like, everybody needs more self-directed learning and there's all these problems with being dependent. Yet, you went through mostly a traditional school, you got degrees, you went through the system, it worked for you. So who are you to say it doesn't work? Like, you benefited from it. Now I'm assuming maybe you had more of an alternative education, but I hear that a lot. Like, parents will say it about themselves, like, yeah, but I went through it and I turned out
It's
okay.
a great point, Isaac.
What's your response
I'm
to
a
that?
public school grad. I went to an independent school for 1 year of my, K-12 environment, but mainly public school. Maybe a couple years as a first or second grader, but the longer I've been in this work, and I just wrote a piece on this too. A lot of parents and caregivers, and I used to think this, school is about fit. Do my kids fit there? And I think I know what they mean. They mean, are they happy? Does it work for them? But I've come to appreciate social institutions, learning environments that are schools, as places of cultivation that are designed to do something intentional to people, because young people are enjoying their time every day practicing stuff. They're getting better at that stuff over time. So I grew up in industrial age models that were designed, explicitly or not, to cultivate math, science, social studies, English language arts, and some level of socialization, and maybe some electives. Mine was Latin. And I did that. I mean, that's what it did to me. And the theory of change was like, if I can master those things, then I'll do good in college, and then if I do good in college, then I'll do good in the real world. And then what I learned when I got into the real world was, oh, actually, this is not enough. In fact, some of the stuff that I learned really deeply and got really good at is not useful at all. I mean, what was useful was like the brain training, the being flexible in mind. But as an adult, I had to realize, like, oh, wow, I actually need to be a self-starter. I need to learn how to learn for myself. I need to be more entrepreneurial. I need to learn how to work as a teammate. I mean, it took me, Isaac, a good 10 years after graduating college to figure out how to like take feedback well and want feedback. I was so offended because my school was not designed to teach me that. So I think as parents and caregivers, it's incumbent upon us now to say, all right, we're rearing these humans to launch from our homes, and what are the knowledge, craft, and skills that they really need to win their future, to like have the kind of agency, and by that I mean the skill and the will to achieve their goals and dreams that they're being called to, right? And I think when we answer that question today in 2025, it's different, than how we answer that in the 90s, which is when I went to high school. Now it's much more holistic. It does include some components of character. It does include some components of like marketplace skills. It includes some social and emotional health. I mean, to me, that is one of the biggest, massive. I mean, nobody in my high schools was talking about, emotional health and how to be in touch with your feelings and make a plan to get your needs met, and not put that on other people. But that's like crucial information for kids today, especially in this like generation of anxiety. So I think I didn't have any say in where I went, but I also didn't know what I knew then. So you're right. It did work for me, but then it didn't. And I had to learn as an adult. And so I think now I'm trying to help my kids bridge that gap a little bit more and make it more relevant. I mean, in education, as a sector, we don't spend money on R&D historically. And so it has evolved much slower than like medicine, communications, media, and all that. And so it's just been vastly, vastly irrelevant. And we're trying to make it relevant.
Yeah, I love the three words compared to what, and when someone's like, oh well, it worked for me or it worked for, it's always like, well, compared to what? I mean, I could I could grow up under horrible circumstances and not have very much food to eat and all kinds of horrible things, and I could turn out okay, and I could turn out and say I like my life. Does that mean I think that is the best thing I should do for my own children? Like those things don't necessarily follow. So and then being able to recognize too, like the world continues to change as well. So even if you felt like it was successful for you and it accomplished these things, your kids are different than you. The world is different than it was. So always reevaluating and asking, like, okay, well, what do I think is best? What am I trying to accomplish with this? If it's preparation for a career, what could that look like? If it's that moral character foundation that we're talking about, there's a lot of different goals and maybe it's multiple, but being able to just assess and not assume, well, whatever worked for me, let's just keep doing that without thinking. Maybe that ends up being the answer. Maybe that is the best thing, but at least going into it, knowingly. And I think one of the things that when you mention mental, emotional health, one of the things that really has lagged behind as the pace of change technologically, economically, career wise has increased, ability to deal with uncertainty is so important. And if you kind of have that school environment, at least in the traditional way, there is very little uncertainty. You know what's coming, you know your subjects, you know your tests, you know what you're graded on, and so you kind of go through this system where you know what winning looks like. Then you enter a market where consumers' preferences are constantly changing, technology is changing, what's valued in the market changes all the time, and you don't know what's going to be valuable tomorrow. And that can be like mentally and emotionally brutal to deal with if you've never learned to work in a highly like an environment of high uncertainty. So I'm curious because Acton, and I'm assuming the Forest School has a point of view. It's not one of these completely wide open kids just do whatever you want. It has a point of view. It has some structure. How do you, within sort of a somewhat of a structure, how do you try to present a little bit more of that real world uncertainty element so that kids at a younger age learn how to be adaptive, entrepreneurial, and to roll with sort of unknowns or things that don't have a simple yes or no, correct or incorrect answer, or a simple letter grade. Like I always use this example with writing. If you're writing for an English teacher, you can figure out pretty quickly what they think good writing is and achieve it. If you want to be a professional writer, there's not like a rule for what's going to get people to click or pay or buy. It's not that easy, right? It's much more dynamic. There's a lot more exploration involved. So how do you try to bring a little, because a classroom by nature is like a restricted version of reality. You're not putting people out there in the vastness of all reality and saying, just go figure out life. You're putting some parameters on it and there's kind of an artificial level, but ideally you're like moving them towards full independence and not keeping them, totally isolated. So I'm just curious, like, how do you think about trying to do that? Trying to like expose them to the real world, but in a way that has some
I
structure
love
and
that
some
question.
guardrails.
So the short answer is we design open-ended real world challenges and give them to the learners regularly. And the challenges are ones in which it's really impossible to predict the final outcome, what that final product or, is actually going to look like, and sometimes even the process. And so just a few examples. So our English language arts program is called Story Arts. We're next to the biggest movie studios in the world. It's called Trilith Studios. Think like Black Panther, Endgame, Infinity Wars, World War Z, all these super. Yeah.
Atlanta's
So
the
we have
new Hollywood, I
when you think
know.
about English as like story, there's a lot of benefits from research, cognitively, emotionally, intellectually, with that. So we give them story arts challenges where they have to make a story. It might be a video, a YouTube video, or online school. We have the Forest School Online is working on making on YouTube shorts right now. It could be a TV script. It could be a movie script. It could be a real estate pitch. It could be a data visualization. There's all sorts of different ways of telling stories, but it's pretty open ended. And what they'll use are real world templates that like people in those fields actually use. But then what they and the content of they're going to share, like who knows, where they're going to go with it. And so they have some choice there. Another example with Acton is they're called quests, and for our quests, we for school and the for school online, we really emphasize having real world users. By that, I mean people or groups who have real world problems, So right now our high schoolers are working with our town on a project surrounding bicycles. And it's both a technical and an adaptive challenge. They're trying to design bike paths for the town, but that's technical, but adaptive. They're trying to get parents, adults, and kids out of golf carts and out of cars and into bikes. And that's a more adaptive, wicked challenge. And who knows?
Those golf carts in the South are religion.
Near where we are, there's this town called Peachtree City a few miles away that's like over 100 miles of golf cart paths. It is like, I don't know why there's not a Netflix, documentary about it, but that's what we're tackling, is real stuff. Our elementary kids helped design a roller coaster, nearby, with this like struggling, amusement park that was local. And, so open-ended challenges. And then lastly, like as they graduate, our kids sent the nation's first mastery-based transcript, which is a really great way for college admissions officers and employers to get to know a young person. It's not just like your typical, algebra 2, B, 3.0, 86 or whatever, which doesn't really tell you a lot about the person. It's almost like a LinkedIn profile for kids where they can showcase their very best work and the skills that they've mastered over the course of their career. And so in that process, our learners have a chance of thinking through, okay, beyond these sort of like core mastery credits that I have to master to get out of the forest school, like what else am I really good at? What else have I figured out, And is it a social and emotional factor? Is it a marketplace skill? Is it a collaboration skill? Or is it like an academic skill? And then they get a chance to navigate that uncertainty, to look inward and figure out, here's what I'm good at. And here's the evidence that I want to show the world that I actually have mastered at some level, that particular skill. I couldn't resonate more though, Isaac. I tell my team often the older I get, the more I enjoy working with folks who are just completely comfortable with uncertainty, and folks who can navigate that for sure are incredibly valuable team members. And as you were talking, I was thinking about folks who might be listening here who are employers, of folks who are coming out of college and 20 somethings, and it's what they want. And it's what they're looking for. And it is lacking at the moment in our nation for sure.
I love the way to demonstrate your skills. I had a previous startup doing something similar to that, but what I always try to harp on with young people who are trying to enter the workforce, that there's really just two things that will determine your success in your career: your ability to create value for other people and your ability to prove it. And you could call it skills and signal. And like, you have to be able to signal your value creation ability, and you have more tools than ever to be your own credential without saying, hey, this third party over here said that I'm good, so you can trust that. Because the value of those is declining. Like, everybody has degrees. Nobody really knows what it means. If I see someone who applies for a job and they say, oh, I have a degree in marketing, I have no confidence that they're good at marketing based on that. If they can say, check out this landing page I built and this email sequence and these ads I ran on Facebook, right? They can be their own credential. They can show me something. So I love that you're working that in from such an early age. So I heard, and this is something I'm really excited to ask you about, because I have had this thought at various times, like, how cool would that be? And you have actually done it. You had some of your students help design their own school building. Is this correct? Tell me about this. How did it come about?
It was awesome.
How did it go?
It was 5-ish, 6-ish years ago. And it started with elementary learners, and we gave them the challenge: if you could design any school, what would you do? And they got together in groups for what was called the architecture quest. And they learned about design and construction and interiors and exteriors. And they put together, each group, a prototype, a model. Imagine cardboard, pipe cleaners, popsicle sticks, all the things. And then at a public exhibition, we brought in the head of our town, where we hoped the school would eventually be. We brought in some interior design experts, some architects, and some construction experts to give feedback and weigh in. The kids presented their findings to that group, and the group sort of highlighted the best ideas. And the best ideas won. There was a winner. But when we took all the best ideas from all the different groups, and then we took those ideas and gave them to an architect in Atlanta, who then turned around with the building that we're in now. And just a few key features of it. Oh, and then by the way, the year after that, the middle schoolers explored biomimicry and ways to incorporate some biomimicry elements, into the school as well. We took the best ideas, gave them to the architect, and so some of the best ideas that endured, some massive ones. I mean, we're only on 0.8 acres, and originally, old school me thought, well, to maximize the outdoor space, we just need one big building, and that way we'll have a big, yard. And all the kids were like, no, 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 we need a courtyard where we can all hang out, and there need to be separate studios. That's our word for classrooms, like surrounding that courtyard. And it's the best. To me, it's one of the best things about school, Isaac. You have 3-year-olds and 18-year-olds hanging out together in this courtyard. It's so, so cool. I mean, it is like, it's awesome. They wanted a ton of natural light. So we have all these really expensive, beautiful windows. They wanted really high ceilings. And then when you look at, learning design and the impact of facilities on learning, I mean, having both those things, natural light, high ceilings, expands possibilities and, can help with deeper learning. And, they wanted storage. They wanted bathrooms, which we agreed. Those were also critical. But, at our groundbreaking ceremony, and then when we finally opened, we thanked the heroes. Heroes is our word for students because they're on a hero's journey. We thanked the heroes who came up with these ideas, and then of course, as we raise funds, we're like, hey, these were the learners' ideas. This is what they are envisioning. And honestly, Isaac, at the time that we did this quest, we did not have land. We did not have money. We were just hoping and dreaming and believing, to be honest. And then sure enough, I mean, the town at Trilith, donated land to the school, which was incredibly generous, that the school now owns. And then we did a capital campaign, with the learners at the forefront and their vision at the forefront, and moved in about this time last year.
That's amazing. That's amazing. It's so funny. This is something that I had never thought about for years. Just the impact. I mean, everybody's like aware of it vaguely, but the impact of the built environments around us on just everything. And when I moved from Washington, D.C., I was there for a couple years, did not like living there, but moved to Charleston, South Carolina. And I started to notice like, I would just feel so happy just driving to the grocery store and back, because along that drive, there was like a little marsh that I could see through the trees and I started to notice like my quality of life because of the way that things were laid out. And I came across a thinker named Christopher Alexander, who I recommend to people constantly. He was an architect, but he ended up essentially spinning out kind of a philosophy of life itself based on a lot of these principles. But and reading through his stuff, talking about how you can walk into a room or any kind of built environment, and it can either make you feel more alive because it is in harmony with like the natural patterns that humans tend to have, or it can be in conflict with those and make you feel stress, like subliminally, like you're not even aware of it, subconsciously. And he gave a really simple example. He's like, humans are phototropic, we're drawn to light. And we also, if we're going to be in a place for a very long time, we want to be able to sit down. Otherwise, it feels like we're ready to leave. And so if you enter a room that has a chair and it has a window, if the chair is facing away from the window, the room feels, and it adds to your stress. It has this inherent conflict. Do I go towards the window or go to the chair? But if the seating areas are like oriented roughly towards the light, you feel this harmony, right? And I started to look around and just like notice things. And I'm not kidding, like rearranged a room in my house just based on that alone. Like, oh, the chair's like the back of the couch is up against the window. So you're looking away from the light and nobody ever sits in that room. I literally just moved it so that the couch is this way and you're kind of looking. And now everybody sits in there looking at books and stuff all the time. And it's like more inviting. So anyway, as I started looking at that, then you go to visit a typical educational environment. Many of them are these brutalist buildings, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that literally like crush your spirit just looking at them and being in them, like low ceiling cinder block fluorescent lights. You got bathrooms with no doors and no privacy. Everything is just very like very soul crushing. And that difference, man, like that alone, what it does for kids to be in an environment that's not hostile to them, that's more inviting, that has the natural light, that has outdoor spaces and the transition from in to out. It's unbelievable. And that's what I think one of the big benefits has been a very long tirade, but one of the huge benefits of with COVID and since COVID, lots of parents have realized my kid can do a lot of things at home. And maybe I want him to do a couple days a week at a school or whatever. Most people's homes are more inviting and better than the typical public school. And like kids not being forced into something that's kind of prison like so much,
It's a
I think is
great
actually a really,
point,
really
Isaac.
positive
And
thing.
ironically, the school building that we were in temporarily before this building that the learners designed was also built by the same company that built prisons in our state. So it was we used that as a way to like rally even more fundraising, like help us get out of here. But through that process, Isaac, we sat down with the architects, our guides, which is our term for teacher. They did a great job too. They had some great input because we sort of looked at our daily schedule and considered the different modalities that our learners are in over the course of a day. And there's actually seven, that are they're in, like they're discussing a lot. They're exploring a lot. They are making things, they're sharing, they are evaluating, they're reflecting, and they are submitting things. Sometimes they're convening and we're welcoming in, folks we're hosting, but we looked at all those different modalities and we're like, all right, what needs to be true of the spaces, given that? And they feel a lot like co-working spaces for kids, frankly, that have flexible mobile furniture. And I do think you see in some, traditional teacher-centric environments, whether it's public or private, I think you see some folks moving in that direction with their facilities, and that's great. And I
Yeah,
think if we get there as a nation, it'd be even better.
I love it. Tyler, this has been awesome. Give me a final. I always like to think about the parent who is like, okay, I see what you're saying. I want that. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if it's accessible for me to, change the way that my kid's being educated. What do you have to say to those parents who are like, they're kind of there, they're close, but they're
Yeah.
a little concerned. They're worried that their kid won't be normal or that, there's going to be some
Yeah,
issue
I
there.
would
What
encourage the
encouragement would
parent,
you have?
and I've Isaac deeply enjoyed this too. I would encourage that parent to take full responsibility for the rearing of their children. And what I mean by that is I would invite them to think through, the moment that they feel they want to launch their young person, into the world, whether it's 18 or 21 or whatever it is, like what knowledge, craft, and skills do those parents and caregivers really want to make sure that learners have practiced by that time? And to take full ownership of that and to not delegate that to, any institution, and then to use that lens to assess schools or schooling opportunities, and say, well, if you care a lot about faith, for example, or if you care a lot about collaboration, or if you care a lot about creativity, look at the daily schedule of the learning environment that you're considering, and are they practicing creativity? Are they practicing talking about and exploring faith? Are they practicing working in groups a lot? If they're not, do not hold the school accountable for that, and just understand what it is you're getting yourself into and don't put that on the school. I mean, sure, you could ask them like, would you be willing to consider that? But like really partner with that leader and say like or that leadership team, and say, what is it that this place is designed to do, and appreciate the fact there's going to be a gap. There will always be a gap between what a school is able to do for you and your kids, and what you want for them. And so take full responsibility for the gap and just choose which gap you want, and give thanks for the great school that you're a part of. Don't put too much on them, because I'm telling you, like leading a school, being an educator at school is unbelievably hard work. And one of the reasons as a nation that people are not staying in the field for very long is because educators and school leaders are taking the brunt of a lot of parent fears and anxieties. And so it's because folks have not taken full responsibility. So as a parent caregiver, I would say take full responsibility for the rearing of your child and figure out how to get it done through multiple different sources.
I love that. Whatever educational institutions utilizing. They can't do everything. There will be gaps, and choose your gaps. That is a great message. Tyler, thank you so much. This has been a
Isaac,
blast.
thank you. Great to be with you.
Appreciate the